For the best part of my later years, I worked as a private investigator. But in 1954, something terrible happened that I could not avoid.
So I thought I'd chat to you a little bit about the cameras of Conway. It's something that we've not necessarily tackled before in our games. From our previous game, The Occupation, I dabbled in cameras a little bit with the cinematics and the cutscenes, but we never actually had any gameplay-driven cameras. And so for every game that we do, we try and give ourselves a new technical challenge. So from ETH1 to The Occupation, we'd never done any kind of cinematics and we'd never had any characters. And so with this game, we wanted some in-world fixed cameras to kind of set the genre of the game, as it were. As I mentioned in a previous video, Conway actually started off as a first-person game, and just one day we were playing around with the mechanic ideas, and we just decided to place a camera in the corner of the room one time, and it just instantly opened up the space, and it's what the game needed. And so from there on out, we could almost approach the game as a third-person game, and we like the idea of these fixed cameras in the space, and so the player can kind of navigate around almost like an adventure game. So it took a little bit of back and forth. There was a lot of prototyping and experimentation because we had never tackled a game that wasn't first person before. And so it kind of led to a few discoveries and a few learnings along the way. Most of it was trial and error. It was just kind of interesting to dig into the kind of camera aspect of Unreal, maybe to create a few custom tools that we wanted to work on, and also just to kind of give the game a unique feel. We definitely like a cinematic aspect to our games. In previous videos, we kind of highlighted films like Prisoners and films that David Fincher may have done, and also, inspired by Rear Window. So it's taking those genres and kind of seeing, okay, well, what is the white paper spin on this? How do we approach cameras in video games? And hopefully a different way. The first real test was just to get cameras in the world. So we were just using out-of-the-box Unreal Engine tools. There's such thing as a cinematic camera in Unreal Engine, and we just dotted them throughout the world. And this was more just to get an idea of coverage. Essentially that means just what angles do you want to play with in terms of driving the gameplay. And it's kind of a tough thing to approach because cameras are such that you can use them as an extra tool. So in first-person games, the tools as game designers were, if you want to guide the player in a certain direction, maybe you make a sound, or maybe you have a light flicker, or these kind of tools that you can use to grab the player's attention. We like to do things as diegetically as possible, which means we tend to not use heavy UI elements. As I said from The Occupation, we only really approached cameras from a cinematic perspective, and that was me kind of just dabbling my toes in the water, as it were. And they were just very short cinematics. They were spread throughout the game, and they weren't used to progress the story. It was almost like a parallel story going on, which concluded at the end of the game. And that was a lot of learning in its own right. But we almost had to set up a new production process for the cameras of Conway, because there's a few different moving elements going on here. When we traditionally block map a level, we flesh out the gameplay space. My background is very much in level design, so me and Oliver work very closely, and the back and forth of I'd go in and kind of compose a space and kind of get it architecturally constructed. It's a very collaborative process back and forth. But once we got the initial level design locked down, it doesn't actually go through too much iteration throughout development. Now, small things will change throughout the game, how we gate and lock the player off from certain areas. Because we try to compose our game worlds on real world locations, we want the player to feel like they have a sense of place and space. We want them to feel like they're actually exploring these places if they existed in real life. We definitely make our environments very grounded. So in that respect, we kind of adhere to other game design techniques rather than scrapping entire levels and redesign them for gameplay purposes. It's more moving these elements around. With the introduction of cameras, it means we have this extra element to think about. We need to know where those cameras are going to be positioned, both to help guide and drive the player into certain directions, but also, from an aesthetic level, we want them to be cinematically interesting. There's a few different camera types that we actually use in Conway. We have the traditional just gameplay camera. This could be a fixed camera that we place in a space, or it could actually be a moving camera. So I mentioned directors such as David Fincher before, and you notice in those films there's a lot of kind of very static but on rail camera movement. So you'll see cameras kind of panning through the scene and following the action going through the scene. And I really like the use of camera rails. I think they add a lot to films, but also in a gameplay scenario, you can think if the player's moving through an environment and you have a camera that's on a rail following them, it can track them one-to-one, and it could not be one-to-one in certain circumstances, but it follows their movement and you get a real nice cinematic feel to that. And then also we have the establishing cameras. So if we enter a new space, for example, and we want the player to feel rewarded for finding this space, something that we call an establishing shot. So we can kind of pan around the scene and show the player this new space. And then also just the insert shot idea that we've taken from films as well. So when the player can comment on a certain action or they want to look in a certain direction, we can kind of almost edit on the fly. The camera out of the box has a few presets. So one thing I wanted to do with this game was have quite a wide aspect. It's something that I like seeing in films. It comes with its own inherent gameplay issues, and in the occupation we kind of made a step towards this kind of aspect to our games. With this game, during pre-production-ish, I actually went to cinema and watched Toy Story 4, and I was amazed by how wide that aspect was. And they were filming I think 2.4:1, something along those lines. And I kind of went back and I think it's Patrick Lynn, the director of photography. He did the short Blue Umbrella, and I was kind of breaking down their process and seeing how they would set up their shots, essentially, because if you think about an animated movie, that's kind of the mid-ground between an in-world kind of real, as it were, film. Between video games is something like a Pixar film where they use 3D technology and they can get 3D character performances, but it's not quite, the cameras don't have to react to the player. The cameras are still pre-scripted and every shot is linear in that respect. So we started with, I kind of set the camera to 2.42:1 in this game. No specific reason for the 0.2 there, but it just, that felt like the right aspect to be working with. And then everything from that point, we kind of were allowed to set presets. So, Martin coded a preset for each camera where I could select between just a wide shot, which, I want a lot of coverage in the scene. And then I could go, into a close-up shot and just have different out-of-the-box presets, because, in Unreal Engine, you'd have to set those properties per camera. Whereas if I have a few go-to cameras, and you can think of this as almost my arsenal of lenses inside of Unreal. So if I hit wide shot, it'll instantly give me a 12mm lens by default and just set all the aperture correctly. And then generally what I'll do is I will have the f-stops around 2.8 to 22, and then also be tracking the player in the focus, because the player can move throughout the scene. The focus will follow Robert Conway as he's moving through the scene. And then generally what I would do for a close-up is I would switch to 30 and have a much smaller f-stop, so it'd be 1 to 1.5, and just really the focus method would be manual, and I'd just go through and tick the focus plane and just really just try and focus in on whatever element. Generally it'd be a character performance. Generally we'd only cut to close-ups with someone's animation performance, so I'd get quite tight up in their face. I don't tend to like to cut too often for a couple of reasons. One, it kind of breaks the immersion for me, because you're trying to control the character, and the more you're switching context, even if it's just a couple of milliseconds of I've got to adjust, there's still kind of that cognitive load for the player there. You don't notice it as much in film. You almost want, cuts can drive the pace of the scene. Whereas in more gameplay driven areas, I try to not cut so often. I try to just get the correct coverage to begin with and just track the player through the level. That being said, there are certain instances, because it's a player-driven game, as you know, video games tend to be. When we're trying to see the world through Robert's eyes, I like to add some handheld movement because I think just a static camera just makes it feel too, floating camera, as it were. So in our first-person games, you kind of want to add subtle head movement to the player's camera to make the player feel grounded in the world, and kind of take the same approach with this game. So whenever we go to a first-person camera, what I like to do is set a couple of different types of camera shake, and these can be super subtle. It can just be a slight bit of movement. And I actually recorded them with just something like this, which was quite a cheap setup, and I just got a handheld camera rig. And the main element to this, it has a bit of weight to help support the shot, but the main thing I'm using here is just this 5 tracker. And the good thing about Unreal Engine is that you can actually track these trackers one-to-one inside of Unreal. I actually learned this technique from, I think I saw Ninja Theory doing it first on the Hellblade game, and then I think it was the Quixel demo where they were doing the handheld movement of the sci-fi ship going through the environment. And it's just, instead of doing these hand-keyed animations in sequencer that never quite feel handheld, what I can do is I can just kind of put this on my shoulder and actually hit record in sequencer, and this tracker would be mapped to a camera in the scene. So if I hit record, and even if I want a super still shot and I'm just trying to get that performance, just in that itself, it's added such subtle movement that this tracker can pick up on, and it can add the keyframes. So even if it's a really still movement that the player wouldn't necessarily notice, but they would feel that something's different without knowing that it's different. Adding those kind of subtleties, I hope really helps sell the player and them being grounded in the world. And of course, you can do stuff like when you're in a scene with multiple actors. There's only a few instances where I do this. The handheld movement should only really be 5% of the game. We don't want it to feel like a shaky handheld camera kind of game. But if there's a character performance here and then that character speaks to someone else and I want to cut to that, rather than just setting the key to go to that character, if I physically can see that character and then I move to them, even if I overshoot a little bit and come back on myself, it just adds more of a feeling like Conway is there in the world investigating these people. And hopefully it's just a nice subtle tool that we can use to just help sell the believability of the world more. So that's about it for the cameras. We use a few different techniques, and again, I've been working quite closely with Martin on the different tools that we can get, and we just try to do it so it's more out of the box for what we need, because there's so many cameras in a scene, whether it be the gameplay driven cameras, the cinematic cameras, the screen locks that we were talking about, where you go in and investigate a certain area and you're more in first person mode, and then like I said towards the start, the more establishing shot driven scenes, and then the insert shots. But that's pretty much, as a summary, what we do with cameras in Conway, and hopefully it helps sell the game and the immersion of the game without distracting you too much from the actual investigation.